On the coast of Maine, an ordinary fisherman makes a discovery that changes everything. What secret does the sea reveal after the storm? And why did fate choose him? Stay until the end to find out the truth. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The cold morning air of the Maine coast always carried a scent of salt and loneliness. The sea stretched endlessly, dark and restless, reflecting the pale sky above. Jonathan Craig, a weathered fisherman in his late 50s, guided his small boat through the mist. He had spent nearly his entire life on this water, tending lobster traps, mending nets, and talking to the waves as if they were old friends. Since his wife Ellen had passed away 3 years ago, the ocean had become his only companion. Every morning, before the sun had risen fully, he would launch his worn-out vessel, the Marlin, and sail toward the reefs near St. Matthew's Island. That morning, after a storm that had howled through the night, the sea looked strange, quieter, heavier, as though exhausted from its own rage. Jonathan noticed pieces of driftwood and seaweed floating by, remnants of the tempest. He adjusted the motor and scanned the horizon. Out of habit, he checked his traps one by one, noting with some satisfaction that most had survived the storm. Then, as he approached the small, uninhabited island of St. Matthew, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another piece of debris, perhaps an old chest or broken crate tossed up by the waves. But as the boat drew closer, the object's shape became clearer, long, rectangular, with edges softened by time and covered in barnacles. It was wedged between two jagged rocks, half submerged in sand. Jonathan's brows furrowed. It looked like a coffin. His hands tightened on the wheel. For a long moment, he simply stared. He'd found strange things at sea before, wreckage, animal bones, even a half-sunken fishing boat, but never anything like this. The idea that a coffin could wash ashore unsettled him deeply. The island was remote, unreachable by foot, and there were no burial grounds anywhere near. He circled the site slowly, his heart pounding, the quiet lapping of the water amplifying the eerie stillness around him. Finally, he anchored a short distance away and took out his radio. "Coastal Patrol, this is Marlin 12. Over," he said, his voice steady but uneasy. After a few seconds of static, a voice answered, "Go ahead, Marlin 12. Jonathan described what he saw: a wooden coffin-shaped object about 6 feet long, coated in barnacles, lodged against the rocks near St. Matthew's Island. The officer on the other end asked him to maintain distance until a patrol could investigate. Jonathan agreed, though the word distance barely settled his nerves. He lowered the radio and looked back toward the shore. He could almost feel the object staring back at him. Curiosity clawed at his chest. What could be inside something like that? Was it really a coffin? Or perhaps an old maritime chest from a shipwreck? His mind drifted to the stories old sailors used to tell in the taverns about cursed treasure, drowned sailors seeking peace, or spirits trapped in relics of the deep. He shook his head to drive the thoughts away. Yet the unease remained. The sea was still. Even the gulls seemed reluctant to cry. He sat in silence, listening to the creak of the boat and the gentle slap of waves against its hull. Every few minutes, he glanced back at the radio, waiting for another call from the patrol. Nothing came. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the stillness began to feel unbearable. His thoughts wandered to Ellen, how she used to tell him that curiosity was a dangerous thing for lonely men. He smiled faintly at the memory, then sighed. When he finally stood, it was with a mix of caution and inevitability. He untied the small dinghy attached to his boat and rowed toward the island, the oars dipping silently into the gray water. As he neared the shore, he saw more clearly how old the object was. The wood was darkened, eaten away in places, and iron bands held its frame together, though most were rusted through. It truly was a coffin, or something built to look like one. Jonathan stepped onto the rocky beach. His boots sank slightly into the wet sand. The wind brushed his face, carrying the lingering chill of the storm. He walked closer, examining the object from a few feet away. There was something solemn about it, almost sacred, as if time itself had forgotten this relic. But the sea had finally chosen to return it. He felt both drawn and afraid. He knelt beside it, running a calloused hand over the wood. Bits of barnacles broke away under his fingers. Beneath the decay, he noticed faint carvings, curved lines, maybe once part of an emblem or initials. He couldn't make them out. The craftsmanship looked old, far older than anything he had ever seen on the coast. A thought struck him. This could be from a ship that went down centuries ago. The idea filled him with awe. He leaned back, breathing slowly, the wind tugging at his jacket. The rational part of him knew he should wait for the authorities. But something deeper, an instinct, a feeling he couldn't explain, urged him to look inside. He hesitated, torn between sense and compulsion. The sky above began to clear, a pale light breaking through the clouds, casting silver reflections over the waves. It was as if the world itself held its breath. He took one last look toward the horizon. No patrol boat in sight. His pulse quickened. He swallowed hard and whispered to himself, "Just a quick look." Then, bracing both hands on the rusted lid, he began to pry at the edge where the wood had split. It didn't budge. He tried again, this time with a piece of driftwood as a lever. The wood groaned in protest, and for a moment he thought it might break apart completely. Then came a faint crack, a sound that made his heart race. He froze, every muscle tense. Nothing moved. Only the sea's distant whisper filled the silence. He glanced toward his boat, as if expecting someone to stop him. But there was no one. Alone on that forgotten island, Jonathan Craig felt the weight of centuries pressing around him. And in that moment, he knew that whatever was inside would change his life forever. The lid shifted slightly under his grip. He stared at it, trembling, uncertain whether to continue. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint, almost sorrowful hum that seemed to rise from the sea itself. He exhaled slowly, his breath shaking in the cold air, and whispered, "All right then." The coffin creaked again, as though answering him. And with that sound, half invitation, half warning, the first chapter of his fate began to unfold. Jonathan stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the object before him. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks filled the silence, and the gray light of dawn spread slowly across the island. His fingers trembled slightly as he brushed away the seaweed clinging to the darkened wood. Now that he was up close, there was no doubt left. It was a coffin, heavy and ancient, bound by rusted iron hinges and half-eaten by salt. A faint smell of decay mixed with the ocean scent. And though centuries might have passed, it felt alive somehow, as if holding the breath of the sea itself. The rational part of Jonathan's mind screamed at him to step back, to return to the boat and wait for the patrol, but curiosity had taken root too deeply. He told himself he only wanted to examine the carvings to understand where it came from. Yet every move he made pulled him closer. He walked slowly around the object, his boots crunching against the sand and gravel. The sides of the coffin were covered in intricate engravings, barely visible under the crust of barnacles. He could make out faint patterns that resembled vines and waves, symbols that seemed to tell a story. It didn't look like a sailor's burial chest, nor like something crudely built for the sea. Whoever had made this had done so with care, skill, and purpose. He crouched down and traced one of the patterns with his fingertip, feeling the grooves worn by time. The craftsmanship reminded him of something he'd once seen in a maritime museum, perhaps Victorian or earlier. The realization made his pulse quicken. What was a coffin from the 19th century doing here on this barren island? The radio in his boat crackled faintly in the distance, but the words were lost to the wind. He knew they were probably calling to check his position, but the thought of leaving now was unbearable. The storm had delayed the patrol. It might take them hours to reach him. Jonathan's instincts, sharpened by years of facing the unpredictable sea, told him this find was extraordinary. Yet there was a strange heaviness in his chest, a pull between awe and dread. He picked up a flat piece of driftwood and slid it gently into the narrow gap between the coffin's lid and its base. The metal hinges creaked, but held firm. He stopped. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was dangerous. The stories he'd heard in his youth echoed in his mind. Sailors who'd opened cursed chests, men who'd gone mad from treasures they found. He clenched his jaw, trying to push those thoughts away. He stepped back, exhaling hard. "You're losing it, old man," he muttered to himself. The island was silent, except for the low whisper of waves and the occasional call of a distant gull. The isolation felt absolute. The world seemed smaller, wrapped in fog and mystery. He turned toward the water, thinking perhaps he should just wait. But as he looked back, Sunlight broke through the clouds for a brief instant, landing directly on the coffin's surface. The light revealed a small emblem near the head of the box, two interlocked letters barely visible but unmistakable. A and E. The letters were surrounded by faint floral designs, a name, a family crest. Something about it stirred him. Jonathan swallowed hard. The rational voice in his head grew weaker. He had to know. He could almost hear Ellen's voice, gentle and warm, saying his name and warning. But he also remembered her curiosity, her belief that every lost thing had a story worth finding. That memory gave him courage, or maybe an excuse. Either way, he placed both hands on the lid again and applied slow, steady pressure with the driftwood. The old wood groaned. A faint crack sounded and he froze, glancing over his shoulder instinctively. Nothing moved. No sign of the patrol. Only the endless horizon. The gap widened slightly, revealing darkness within. A chill swept through him, though the wind had died down. He hesitated again, but the pull of the unknown had already won. He pushed harder, and with a sharp creak, the lid shifted an inch. The sound echoed like thunder in the still air. He waited, heart pounding. Then, unable to resist, he leaned forward and peered through the narrow opening. He saw nothing at first, only shadows and dust. But the air that escaped carried a strange scent, not of decay, but of something metallic and old, like forgotten coins. His breath quickened. Jonathan set the driftwood aside and used his hands, lifting the edge of the lid inch by inch. The hinges shrieked in protest, flakes of rust breaking away. For a moment, he thought the entire structure would collapse. Then suddenly the lid gave way and shifted to the side with a dull thud, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. He stumbled back, coughing, waving his hand. When the air cleared, his eyes widened. Inside, the coffin was not filled with bones as he had expected, but with the faint shimmer of metal. Something glinted beneath the thin layer of silt that had collected over time. He leaned closer, disbelief freezing him in place. Coins, gold coins scattered across the bottom like sunlight caught in water. Beneath them, he saw the edge of a silver cup, the delicate curve of a ring, and what appeared to be a jeweled pendant. For several long seconds, he couldn't breathe. Then the realization hit him with full force. This wasn't a coffin at all. It was a treasure chest disguised as one, or perhaps a burial filled with riches. He blinked, unsure if his eyes were deceiving him. The craftsmanship, the emblem, the placement. It all spoke of wealth and sorrow intertwined. A strange emotion rose in his chest. Not joy, not greed, but something heavier. Grief. There was a story here, a human one, buried under time and salt. He imagined someone long ago, perhaps a captain or a grieving father, laying a loved one to rest with all that was precious to them. The thought tightened his throat. His vision blurred for a moment, and he realized his eyes were wet. He stepped back, pressing a hand to his mouth. Just then, a distant sound reached him, the low hum of an engine. He turned and saw a tiny speck moving across the horizon, the patrol boat. Relief and panic collided in him. They were coming, and he had already broken the seal, already disturbed whatever lay inside. He glanced back at the open coffin, the gold glimmering softly in the pale light. The beauty of it was almost painful. He wanted to look longer, but he knew he couldn't. He quickly replaced the lid as best he could, though it no longer fit perfectly. The sound of the approaching boat grew louder. Jonathan took one last look at the mysterious find before returning to his dinghy. The sea around him seemed different now, quieter, but charged with something unseen. As he rowed back toward his fishing boat, the wind carried a faint echo across the waves, a sound that could have been the call of a bird or the sigh of the past. He didn't look back, but deep down he knew that what he had uncovered was not simply treasure. It was a story that had waited centuries to be found, and it was not done with him yet. The patrol boat arrived just as Jonathan secured his vessel to the shore. The officers climbed onto the rocky beach, their boots splashing in the shallow water. One of them, a younger man named Officer Grant, greeted him with a nod and asked for details. Jonathan, still pale and shaken, pointed toward the weathered coffin resting near the rocks. His voice was quiet, steady only because of habit. "It's there," he said, "been washed up after the storm. I didn't touch much." The lie rolled off his tongue with surprising ease, though his heart still pounded from what he had seen inside. The officers examined the object carefully, documenting it, photographing the markings, and eventually deciding to lift it aboard their patrol boat for transport to the mainland. Jonathan stood apart, watching them. The image of the gold coins and the medallion burned into his memory. Back in the harbor of Portland, the coffin was taken to the State Historical Facility for examination. Jonathan followed the news quietly, avoiding attention, but curiosity and guilt kept him restless. He couldn't forget the faint portrait he had glimpsed on the medallion's surface, the delicate outline of a young woman's face. Every night that week, he dreamt of her standing at the water's edge, her expression calm yet sorrowful, calling him by name in a voice that seemed to echo from beneath the waves. When he woke, the sound of the sea outside his window no longer felt like comfort, but confession. A few days later, he received a call from the historical department asking him to visit. The lead curator, Dr. Eleanor Price, met him in a quiet room filled with marine artifacts and documents. The coffin had been opened under controlled conditions, and its contents were laid out on a long oak table. Jonathan stared in disbelief as he saw the objects again. Gold coins stacked neatly, a silver chalice with intricate engravings, several pieces of jewelry, and the medallion he remembered so vividly. Dr. Price explained that the find was likely from the Victorian era, possibly between 1840 and 1870, and that initial research suggested it had belonged to a wealthy family who lost members during a transatlantic voyage. The preservation of the wood and items indicated the coffin might have been sealed in a sunken compartment of a shipwreck before being released by shifting tides after centuries. Jonathan barely listened. His eyes were fixed on the medallion. He asked if he could hold it, and Dr. Price, after noting his role as the discoverer, handed it to him with gloves. The weight was light, almost delicate, but the emotion it carried felt immense. He turned it over and saw the tiny portrait clearly now. A young woman with calm eyes and a faint smile, her hair tied in a Victorian style. Something about her gaze felt alive, almost familiar, though he couldn't explain why. His throat tightened. "Do you know who she was?" he asked quietly. Dr. Price shook her head. "Not yet, but we believe she may have been the daughter of a prominent family named Ashford. Their ship vanished off the coast in the 1850s. This could be part of that story." The name lingered in his mind long after he left the building. That night, he sat alone by his small fireplace, the sound of wind rattling the windows. The storm from days ago seemed to echo in his memory, carrying whispers of the sea. He closed his eyes and saw the medallion again, shining softly in the pale museum light. The image of the woman's face haunted him, but not with fear, with sorrow, as if she had been waiting for him to find her. He began to wonder if fate had chosen him for a reason. If perhaps this discovery wasn't coincidence, but something larger, an unfinished story reaching out from time itself. Weeks passed as the museum conducted research and verified the authenticity of the artifacts. News outlets reported the find as one of the most remarkable maritime discoveries in Maine's history. Jonathan tried to stay out of the spotlight, but reporters came to his door nonetheless. They called him the humble fisherman who found a Victorian mystery. He refused interviews, though part of him felt proud, not of the treasure, but of the fact that something once forgotten was remembered again. He visited the museum once more, this time after hours, when Dr. Price allowed him private access. The exhibits were quiet, the halls dimly lit. He stood before the glass case where the medallion now rested, surrounded by other recovered artifacts. As he stared, emotion overwhelmed him. He remembered Ellen again, her warmth, her laughter, the way she used to wait for him by the window when storms rolled in. He whispered softly, "She looks like you," though he wasn't sure if he meant it literally or in spirit. His eyes burned with tears, and he realized he was crying not only for what he had lost, but for the tragedy sealed inside that coffin. The sea had taken much from him, his wife, his peace. But now it had also given something back, a story of love, grief, and memory that transcended time. When he finally left the museum, the night air was calm. The moon hung low over the harbor, its reflection shimmering across the water. Jonathan paused by the docks, watching the gentle waves lap against the wooden posts. He thought of the woman in the medallion, of her father, of the ship that had carried their grief into the depths. In a strange way, he felt they were all connected now. Him, the lost souls of the past, and the sea itself, which bound them together in silence. He didn't know yet that this discovery would change everything. The way he lived, the way he saw the ocean, even the way he understood loss. For now he only knew that the tears he had shed on that island had not been in vain. The ocean had given him a story, and through it perhaps a chance to heal. The following months transformed Jonathan's quiet existence into something he could never have imagined. The story of the discovery spread far beyond Maine, reaching national news and drawing the attention of historians, collectors, and journalists. The museum confirmed that the coffin indeed belonged to the Ashford family, a wealthy line from Boston, who had lost a private vessel, the Celestine, in 1854. The records revealed that Captain Thomas Ashford had been transporting his wife's remains back to England after her untimely death at sea. According to fragments of letters found in maritime archives, his daughter, Evelyn Ashford, insisted on accompanying her father on the voyage. When a storm destroyed the ship near the Maine coast, most of the bodies were never recovered. The coffin Jonathan had found was the final piece of that tragedy, preserved and returned by the sea almost 2 centuries later. When Dr. Price shared this with him, Jonathan sat in silence, the weight of the story pressing against his chest. He now knew the woman in the medallion, Evelyn Ashford. The state recognized his discovery officially and rewarded him with 30% of the collection's appraised value. The number seemed unreal to him, over $2 million. For a man who had lived modestly his entire life, it was more than fortune. It was freedom. Yet Jonathan felt no thrill. The check he received from the museum's trustees lay folded on his kitchen table for days before he even deposited it. What could he possibly buy that meant more than what he had found already? The money felt like an afterthought, a small echo of something far greater. When reporters came asking how he planned to spend it, he simply said, "On something that lasts longer than I will." Still, the change in his circumstances was undeniable. His neighbors in the small harbor town of York began to treat him differently, some with admiration, others with quiet envy. Fishermen who had once shared coffee with him at the docks now greeted him with awkward politeness, as if unsure whether he was still one of them. Jonathan missed the simplicity of anonymity. He found solace only in returning to the water where the sea was indifferent to his fame. Out there he was still just a man with a boat following the rhythm of the tides. Yet even that had changed. Every time he passed St. Matthew's Island, he felt a quiet pull as though the place remembered him. He often stopped there for a few minutes, gazing at the spot where he had found the coffin, letting the memory settle like sand after a wave. Dr. Price remained in touch with him as the museum prepared a permanent exhibit dedicated to the Ashford discovery. She invited him to attend the opening ceremony as an honored guest, but Jonathan hesitated. Crowds and speeches were never his way. He eventually agreed, though, after she told him that Evelyn's medallion would be displayed separately with his name engraved beside it as a mark of gratitude. The night of the ceremony, he stood quietly among the polished glass cases and warm lights, dressed in a simple suit that didn't quite fit his weathered frame. When Dr. Price spoke to the audience about the intersection of fate, history, and human compassion, Jonathan barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the medallion, gleaming softly in its case. The inscription beneath it read, "Discovered by Jonathan Craig, returned to the light by the sea." He felt tears form again, but this time they did not sting. They felt like release. After the ceremony, a reporter asked if he believed in destiny. Jonathan smiled faintly and said, "I believe the ocean keeps what we've forgotten until it's time to remember." The words spread quickly, quoted in articles and interviews, but to him they were not wisdom, only truth. The sea had always taken and given in equal measure. It had taken Ellen, but it had also given him Evelyn's story, a reminder that love and loss were bound by the same current. As the months passed, Jonathan decided to use his reward not for luxury, but for purpose. He purchased the ruins of an old lighthouse near the bay, one that had been decommissioned decades earlier, and began restoring it with the help of local builders. When asked why, he said it was to give fishermen a place to rest, a warm spot to wait out storms, or share their stories. The project gave him something to wake up for, something meaningful to build with his own hands. Every beam he repaired, every wall he painted felt like penance and gratitude combined. By the time the lighthouse was complete, It looked less like a relic and more like a sanctuary. He named it Ashford Haven in memory of the family whose tragedy had led him here. Inside, he placed a small framed photograph of the medallion beside a brass plaque that read, "In remembrance of those lost to the sea and those found by it." The opening day brought a small crowd of fishermen, townsfolk, and even Dr. Price, who stood beside him as he cut the ribbon. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt peace, a quiet, steady kind of peace that did not come from riches or recognition, but from meaning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan climbed to the top of the lighthouse. The lens caught the fading light and cast a golden beam across the water, illuminating the waves like liquid fire. From up there, he could see St. Matthew's Island, small and still in the distance. He thought of Evelyn, of her father, of the ship that had carried their grief into the depths. He whispered softly into the wind, "You're home now." The air was still, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he heard a faint voice return, not in words, but in feeling, a quiet sense of gratitude carried on the sea breeze as he descended the spiral staircase. The beam of light swept across the darkening water. It felt symbolic, like the past reaching into the present, guiding those who might still be lost. Jonathan knew his life would never be the same. But he also knew that the ocean had not cursed him. It had chosen him. It had given him a story worth telling and a reason to keep the light burning for those who came before and for those who would sail after. Years passed quietly after the lighthouse was finished, and Jonathan found peace in the rhythm of his days. The sea no longer frightened him, nor did it carry the weight of his grief. Each morning, he climbed the narrow steps to the lantern room, polished the brass fittings, and watched the light sweep across the dark horizon. Fishermen often stopped by to rest, share coffee, and tell stories of their catches or storms survived. The lighthouse became a haven for many, a place of warmth built from loss and compassion. Jonathan rarely spoke of the treasure that had made it possible, and when people asked, he would simply smile and say that the sea had given him more than gold could ever buy. The years softened him. His hair turned white, his hands slower, but his spirit stayed steady. The medallion remained with him always. Sometimes late at night, he would sit by the fire and hold it in his palm, staring at the delicate portrait of Evelyn Ashford. He felt no longer haunted by her face, but comforted as if she watched over him from a world beyond storms. He wrote in his small leather journal about her, about Ellen, about how the sea could both destroy and redeem. The journal became his quiet confession, a record of everything he had learned, that grief and gratitude could live together, and that even sorrow could become light when carried long enough. One summer evening, when the air was still and the waves whispered softly against the rocks, Jonathan felt a deep calm settle in his chest. The sunset painted the sky in gold and rose, the same colors that had glimmered inside the coffin years ago. He climbed the spiral staircase one last time, slower now but steady, and stepped into the lantern room. The light flickered as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sea stretched out before him, endless and serene. He took the medallion from his pocket, ran his thumb over Evelyn's portrait, and smiled faintly. "It's time," he murmured. He opened the small window beside the beacon and held the medallion out to the wind. For a moment, the light caught its surface, making it shine like a star. Then he let it fall. The medallion tumbled through the air, catching flashes of sunset before disappearing into the waves below. Jonathan watched until the ripples faded. He felt no sorrow, only peace. The sea had returned what was once its own, and he knew he had fulfilled his part in the story. When morning came, the keeper's chair in the lantern room was empty. Fisherman found the door to the lighthouse open, a journal resting on the table beside a cup of cold coffee. Inside, on the last page, Jonathan had written in his careful hand, "I did not find gold. I found meaning, and that is enough." Beneath the words was a simple drawing of a wave and a small cross above it. The town mourned him, but his memory lingered in the hearts of all who had known him. The lighthouse continued to shine, its beam guiding sailors through fog and darkness. People said that on calm nights, when the tide was low, a faint melody could be heard near St. Matthew's Island, like a woman's voice carried by the wind. The fishermen believed it was Evelyn Ashford, singing her gratitude to the man who had brought her story back to the light. Years later, A bronze plaque was placed at the base of the lighthouse. It read, "In honor of Jonathan Craig, who listened to the sea and found the soul within it." Visitors still came, standing silently by the railing as the beacon swept across the horizon, casting its golden path over the water. Some swore they saw two figures walking the beach below, a man in an old fisherman's coat and a woman in a white dress side by side, fading into the mist as dawn approached. The lighthouse remained lit every night, its beams stretching across the ocean like a bridge between past and present. The sea, eternal and patient, kept its secrets once more. But for those who knew the story, it was no longer just water and waves. It was memory, forgiveness, and love that endured beyond time. The sea always returns what was once lost. Do you believe that nothing happens by chance? Write in the comments where you're watching from. Leave a like and subscribe. There are many more stories ahead that will touch your heart.